This is myth busting the common misperceptions of ranked choice voting. And these objections you're about to hear come from actual emails to legislators. Like, we had legislators send us the stuff that they were getting from people saying that ranked choice voting was bad. So they're lifted directly from those emails. These myths come from people who have been complaining, the opposition, the organized opposition to ranked choice voting, as well as from people who are paid to oppose it. Frankly, some of their op-eds, as well in published pieces that they've written, things that are just, well, you'll see for yourself. They seem a little crazy. What we noticed in picking up all of these objections is they really fit into two categories, two buckets, if you will. And the first bucket, and the much larger bucket, is demonstrably false. And we're getting into those. These attacks are just, they make no sense at all. They're not based in reality. And the second category, which is much smaller, is it's technically true, but is it really an attack on ranked choice voting, or is it an attack on runoffs as an entire concept? Because ranked choice voting is really nothing more than an instant runoff. So that's where these come from. Give me the next one. And so let me go ahead and introduce our guests. Chris Hughes is the Senior Director in Policy and General Counsel for the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. He has contributed to RCV legislation and regulation in more than 20 states and assisted with ranked choice voting implementations in dozens of jurisdictions, from Newton, Utah, population of 794, to New York City, millions. Chris also co-produces the RCVRC's podcast, RCV Clips, and you can follow him on Twitter at this Chris Hughes. Chris is admitted to practice law in the state of New York. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Josh Daniels is an impactful reformer and innovator in the government and election administration as the former county clerk and auditor for Utah County, Utah's second largest county. He was the first to implement ranked choice voting in Utah, and his leadership in election innovation and government efficiency has earned national and international accolades, including recognition from the federal EAC, NACO, and the International Government Blockchain Association. This is a guy who's actually implemented ranked choice voting for municipal elections in Utah. Thank you, Josh. And of course, we've asked Stan to come back because Stan and I, we live this every day, and we've been talking a lot about the way people attack the work that we're doing in advocating for ranked choice voting. So thank you very much. And so the first claim is the ballot design confuses voters, or it's too confusing in general.
False.
Busted, right?
Well, I mean,
why give me some data around that.
Yeah, so we've done the polling every time in Utah that we've had ranked choice elections, which is 3 different cycles now. And we've done polling of various types afterwards, and consistently over 80% of respondents, sometimes as high as 90%, say that it was easy, that the ballot was easy to use, that it was not confusing, that the instructions were clear, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, Representative Chavez-Houck talked about an experience that we had. The first year that we implemented ranked choice voting for municipal elections, we wanted to test some of these issues and really figure out whether or not it really was, in fact, confusing, so that we could better anticipate that and sort of educate voters. And so what we did was we went to these assisted living centers, because a lot of people were saying very ageist remarks, well, the old people aren't going to understand it. Well, I was blown away, because we went and we talked to the residents, and, a lot of them were saying, oh, I've been voting since I was 20 years old. Well, how old are you today? 95? I'm like, oh, okay. You've been voting longer than I've been alive. I'm pretty sure voting is something that is actually pretty easy for you to do, even if you're, older. Anyway, so we handed out ranked choice ballots and gave 0 instructions, 0 explanations, and just listened and engaged to try to detect whether it was confusing and see kind of what concerns were brought up. And it was just so intuitive, and they were talking back and forth. And, well, Phyllis, which is your favorite? Well, my first one is this, but my second one's this. And obviously, just the intuitive nature of ranking that Stan talked about that we all do, they were doing this process without any specific instructions. And that's been reported to me by others who have used it, talking to voters. And to be honest, the people who tell me it's confusing, I have a lot of conversations with political activists, political actors, voters, etc. And to a person, every time, this is exactly how the conversation goes. So what do you think of ranked choice voting? Oh, well, I don't like it. Okay, well, why not? Well, because, the winner and this and that, and they come up with these strategic kinds of things about how they want somebody to win. They want the person to win with the 21% because they're in a very polarized tribe. These are usually very political people I'm talking to. And that's not to say that people don't like it. These are just the people who don't like it. They first say they don't like it, then they tell me it's confusing. And I'm like, oh, and you don't rank things every day? Well, I do. And I'm like, oh, so it's confusing for you. Well, no, it's confusing for other people, theoretically.
So the non-politically active class, the average voter, when polled, says
they like it.
And it's not confusing.
In other words, what I'm saying is the people who say it's confusing are making a disingenuous argument that is not true. And because they think that's a persuasive argument, so they use what they think are persuasive arguments to oppose something that they politically oppose for political reasons. Pretty typical politics.
Give us our next one. Hand recounts or any audit would be difficult, if not impossible. Chris.
I'll talk about this a bit, and I'm curious to hear from Josh, too, because he's run recounts. Fundamentally, a hand recount of any election sucks. It's hard, it's time-consuming, it's not a fun process for anybody, and that's still true for ranked choice voting, but it's not like we're talking about, right? It's a change in process. You'll have to update how you run a hand recount, but from what we've seen, places like New York City and Utah and Minneapolis that have run recounts of ranked choice voting, whether that's entirely by hand or with their machines, it's taken just, more or less as much time as any other hand recount does. It's just not fun regardless. And then for a post-election audit, it's the same thing. You're making some process improvements. You're changing how you count the votes, so you'll have to update your audit processes, but that just means, you'll look at the first ranking and the second ranking and the third ranking on the ballot instead of just that one vote at a time like you might in an audit today. You'll have to update some processes, but it's not the end of the world. It just takes a little bit more effort up front to plan for that and prepare for that.
So, Josh, you've actually run audits of ranked choice voting elections.
Yep.
So that means it's not impossible.
That's right. Yep.
So did it take a lot of time? What was it like? It really quickly, though. But
it took the same amount of time as any other audit. Our audit process wasn't any different than any other election audit, and it takes the exact amount of time, the same amount of time. All you're doing is confirming that a ballot was counted by the system correctly. Now, if you're talking about an audit where you're trying to somehow sample the results of the election and then project that result onto the total as a comparison, that's a separate kind of a thing. That's not how we do audits in Utah. It's not how a lot of states do audits. But there are ways to do that type of audit, even with ranked choice voting. Colorado's been working on that. Boulder, Colorado had a ranked choice election this year, and they did a type of Colorado audit, which is called a risk limiting audit, which does sample the ballots and then compare the results. What we do in Utah is a post-tabulation audit. You compare the ballot to how it was counted.
I want to highlight the Boulder, Colorado mayoral race for just a second, because they declared their winner 2 days after the election, after multiple rounds and runoffs using ranked choice voting. It's a large city in Colorado. And they had a certified winner in days as opposed to 2 months, or 1 month, which is what would happen in Georgia. Next slide there. Ballot exhaustion is one of the big complaints by some of the organized groups against when they like to say that ballots are exhausted, which means they stop being counted when they run out of candidates ranked. Can we talk about ballot exhaustion? What is ballot exhaustion, Stan?
Yeah, so I think it explains it pretty well. A ballot's exhausted when the
So if I'm a libertarian voter in Georgia, I go vote for only my libertarian. I don't rank anybody else.
When those candidates are out, then your ballot stops being counted.
Right.
Right.
Because I chose not to participate in the next round.
Okay, so that's the key. It's about what the voter chooses. So the idea behind ranked choice voting is that you're giving the voter a greater expression of their will. You're not telling them that they have to vote for everyone. You're saying, you get to choose. And you can rank your votes any way you want, and you can choose not to vote for some people that you would not want to vote for. I mean, the key to ranked choice voting is that you put the power in the hands of the voter. So this is just an ad hominem attack that doesn't really have value because, of course, there's some exhausted ballots because voters choose to either vote for all candidates and rank them all or rank a subset of them. But the key is that it's the voter's decision. It's not that the system is manipulating it.
Right.
It's literally a reflection of voter will.
Josh, when you've had elections in Utah, how many in an average race on a percentage basis, if you could ballpark it, how many people decide they don't want to rank in the final rounds?
Typically, when in my experience, once you tally all votes, at the very end, you typically have about 5% or less exhausted ballots or inactive, ballots. And I would argue that in Georgia with the runoff, the voter exhaustion of voters not showing up to the runoff is far greater than the ballot exhaustion that occurs in ranked contests. If you look at a very scientific study or sample, and you look at head-to-head, same year, 2022, and you look at Alaska versus Georgia. Georgia had a runoff. Alaska had ranked choice voting. Both statewide contests. Georgia's voter exhaustion, I didn't show up and vote in the runoff, was 10%. In Alaska, the inactive ballot or exhausted ballot was 5%. So you had double the exhausted ballots in a two-tranche.
I would say it's even more because we had over 500,000 people not participate.
Yep.
They didn't come back the second time for Warnock or Ossoff Purdue.
Right.
We had 750,000 people not come back for Warnock Walker Part 2. And so you have hundreds of thousands of essentially exhausted ballots using our current system.
Yep.
But the advocates or the opponents to ranked choice voting don't frame the drop-off in turnout the way that they do. They like to call exhausted ballots trash ballots. I wonder if they would be willing to accept 750,000 trash ballots because that's what our current system presents to us here in Georgia. Let's go next one. Voters must, this is great, because in addition to them, this actually came from the exact same email as the last point, right? Which these two things cannot coexist at the same time, which voters must rank even the candidates that they fundamentally disagree with or risk their ballot being eliminated or exhausted. So they're basically saying you have to vote for a Democrat if you're a Republican, you have to vote for a Republican if you're a Democrat, or they'll throw out your ballot completely.
I mean, it's what Stan said, right? It's entirely up to the voter. The voter gets to rank as many candidates as they like. As some of my friends who do voter education, as many candidates as they can stand. Because you're not going to love everybody, but there might be people you'll settle for. And we're never going to ask you to rank every single candidate because we're certain there's candidates you hate that you don't want to rank. And we're not going to make people do that.
Also, there's a really significant level of dishonesty going on when people make this argument because oftentimes they are trying to scare voters into thinking that their ballot won't even be counted at all if they don't rank all the names. And oftentimes the opponents know that that's the impression that they're attempting to leave on the voter, when in reality, they're simply saying if you don't rank all the candidates, well then the ranks that you didn't rank aren't going to be counted and your ballot would be, exhausted at that point. And most voters understand that. That's very intuitive. It's like, well, duh, I only ranked these three, and if it's one of the other ones I didn't rank, and then my vote doesn't count towards that determination, but I made that choice, right? So, but we had voters that have called our office that said, I was told if I don't rank all the candidates, my ballot won't get counted. And what they meant was that if the ballot is incomplete, we set it aside and don't count it at all. That's obviously false. And opponents who are making this argument want people to think that that's what happens, and it's not what happens, right? So, but it's just important to call out these lies because when people make politically disingenuous arguments, they are making the case for ranked choice voting. That is exactly why we need ranked choice voting, because the polarization in this country and the way our system works, winner take all, plurality wins, it actually incentivizes politicians to fearmonger. And it incentivizes politicians to make disingenuous arguments so that they can win, so that they can be the mayor that wins with 21% of the vote, right? And so we have to call out disingenuous, dishonest arguments because it undermines everything we're trying to do in terms of civility and good policy.
Well, I'm going to give you plenty of opportunity with some more slides. Nice. Ballots cannot be tallied in precincts and must be counted at a central location. This was actually a claim made by a legislator in a committee hearing earlier this year. Do the ballots have to be centrally tabulated, or can they be tabulated in the precincts like they are today?
You follow 99% of the same processes you follow now for counting ballots as you would in a ranked choice voting election. If you're running plurality or ranked choice voting, you're going to scan everything at the precinct. You're going to count everything up at the precinct. And then right now, to get results, you have to centralize those results. You have to send them to the county, to the state to figure out, who won countywide, who won statewide. You have to do the same thing for ranked choice voting. You can't just take one precinct and say, well, this person won this precinct, therefore they won the election. That's just not how any election works now. And that's, again, what this is implying is like, this is some wild overhaul. That's just not the case. You need to figure out everything centrally to determine the winners now, and you still have to do that in ranked choice voting. You need to figure out who's in last place in ranked choice voting, who got ranked next on each of those ballots, transfer those ballots, make sure you determine who has a majority, but that's not all that different from what you're doing now.
And if you get to, if one candidate does have over 50% of the vote, you're not worried about going to the runoff process. Counting can't begin until all ballots are in, delaying results. So we do pre-counting tabulation. Well, not really. It's pre-scanned. We only tabulate on election day after the polls are closed in Georgia, but we allow for our local elections office to begin with the mail-in absentee ballots to begin processing those in advance. They just don't know what the results of those elections are. Is that still possible with ranked choice voting?
Yes.
Well, and part of the problem with this claim is that, obviously it just doesn't make sense on its face, but what they're trying to say is that winners cannot be determined until all the ballots are in. It's like, right, that's always true, right? So the results are always delayed in the sense that you haven't won until you've been declared the winner. But on election night, we kind of know a preview of some of the results, right? And that's true with ranked choice voting. In Utah County, we did the ranked choice process a dozen times, in terms of interim, unofficial sort of results. We have election night, first report, election night, second report. If you're still around at 2 o'clock in the morning, you could see our third report. And then the next day, when we've counted more ballots, you might get a fourth report. And that's how all elections work. And it doesn't have to be any different with ranked choice voting. One of the problems, though, is that like a state like Alaska, it's a vote-by-mail state because it's so spread out, and it takes time for ballots to be sent in. That's true for all elections, whether they're using ranked choice or not. But you do have some jurisdictions where they make a decision to simply not count or a decision to not release preliminary results. Those are decisions made by election officials. Maybe they have good reasons for those decisions. I don't think those are great decisions because voters want to know preliminary results on election night. And if you're not going to show preliminary results, well, that's on you. It's not on ranked choice voting.
The claim is that it creates a system where votes are reassigned through a series of calculations to candidates for which the voter may not have even voted. Is that possible? If I go and I only rank 2 people, will my vote count for the third person I didn't vote for?
No. It's just like that claim we saw earlier about, I'll be forced to rank everyone on the ballot in order for my vote to be counted. It's all coming from the same place of essentially making people worried that someone else is going to take their vote away from them and make some decision about their vote. The person who's in control of the vote is the voter. The person who actually cast that ballot gets to say who they want that vote to count for. That might be one person, that might be, 3 or 4 people if they ranked that many people on the ballot. That's what this all comes down to. And we heard fear-mongering like this in Alaska, too. People were going around telling voters across the state, if you leave any ranking blank, election officials are going to fill in a bubble on your ballot for whoever you didn't rank. And it's just not true. There's not any other way around it. That's just, one, that would take way too much time. And administrators don't have the time to do that. And 2, it's just not happening. I don't know how else to put it.
Also, some people feel like somehow the ranking ballot sort of necessitates or forces a voter to rank everybody, even if it's just sort of subconsciously, right? And so some people have this resistance. Well, I don't want to rank the people I don't like, and maybe I have a candidate on here who's my last choice, and do I have to rank them? And it's like, well, did you take math? Because if there are 5 candidates and you rank all 5, if you just ranked 4, guess what the 5th candidate is? It's your last choice, right? So, I mean, mathematically, you only have to, your ballot can fully count towards the impact of the results of who wins if you rank n-1, right?
But there's never been any instance anywhere ever in the history of ranked choice voting and all of its uses internationally or within the United States of anybody ever having a vote actually cast for somebody they did not intend to vote for.
Absolutely.
Next slide, please.
And I think that myth, too, comes on this idea that, like, somebody will win the election even if I didn't vote for them. It's like, yep, that happens in every election.
Yeah. So we like to talk about Burlington, Vermont quite a bit. This is this is a point that Heritage Foundation likes to make specifically, that in 2009, a mayoral election in Burlington, Vermont, in a race with 4 candidates, a third-party candidate initially received only 29% of the vote. He came in second behind the Republican, and the candidate in the first 2 rounds of vote tabulation. The third-party candidate was declared the winner in the 3rd round, even though he was not the first choice of nearly 3/4 of the voters. And so there are a couple things here that I'm going to take this one, because I want to introduce you to 2 political candidates who received fewer than 29% of the vote. One of them is named Jeff Duncan. Jeff Duncan got 24% in his primary and went to a runoff, and he won, and he became lieutenant governor of the state of Georgia. The second individual I'd like to introduce you to is Governor Brian Kemp, who got 25% in the first round of his primary and went on to win the second round. This is in the category of technically true. Somebody with 29% of the vote can win. And we see it here in Georgia without instant runoffs, without ranked choice voting. We see it all the time, actually. It's not quite as anomalous as you think it might be. But a candidate in today's system in Georgia can get 25% of the vote and become the winner in a runoff. This isn't a knock on ranked choice voting. This is a knock on runoffs as a whole category of elections. And that, to me, is a dishonest way of attacking it. So we'll go to the next slide.
And Vermont has a 3-party system. They have 3 viable major parties.
Not only that,
progressive.
but Heritage Foundation will tell you that Burlington, Vermont dumped it after this race, but they brought it back.
Yeah.
They don't tell you that they brought it back.
And
And they're using it today.
Yes,
Right.
and they're using it today. If you go to the Burlington, Vermont elections website, you can see a whole paragraph on the benefits of ranked choice voting. Primaries can be eliminated. This is the Alaska question. Primaries can be eliminated, or there could be a jungle primary, and there will be no runoff elections. All party candidates are on one ballot, and the voters asked to rank some or all of the candidates. So I'm going to set this up a little bit more. This is about the Alaska system, which is a primary reform, not just an election reform, but a primary specific reform. Because in Alaska, they put everybody on the same ballot, whether you're 5 or 6 Republicans and 6 or 7 Democrats, and they ask everybody or independents, they ask everybody to vote one time in a jungle primary system. And then the top 4 vote getters advance to the general election, and only then is ranked choice voting used. So this is a completely different reform than what we're advocating here in Georgia. Does ranked choice voting require the adoption of Final 4, Final 5 in order to be used?
no. It doesn't. You can design ranked choice voting in a million different ways. Are you trying to get rid of your runoffs just for your general election? You can do that by adopting ranked choice voting. Are you trying to eliminate ranked choice voting in your primaries? You can adopt ranked choice voting in your primary, have a Democratic primary, have a Republican primary, and just do it that way and get rid of your runoffs. There's a million ways to do it. It's a tool for getting an outcome and a process that works better for you. In Alaska, this made sense, adopting this primary reform with ranked choice voting in the general election. That may not that might not make as much sense in a state like Georgia. It is all down to what is the right fix for the problem you're trying to solve.
Right. Having a specific problem to solve, Stan's talked about this quite a bit. It's not a panacea. It's not a silver bullet for all problems. But talk about the specific, like the importance of emphasizing fixing specific problems for a second, Stan.
Yeah, it goes back to when the senator talked about using his gray matter instead of getting emotional. And in general, our country has rule of the majority while respecting the rights of the minority. And so states have tried to figure out how to implement majority rule. Georgia has chosen to get to a majority through runoffs, and that's really expensive, and you get lower turnout, and it has some challenges. So now they're looking at trying to solve that problem. Ranked choice voting would be front and center of the way that I would solve that problem when I look at all the solutions that are out there. So we need to go see what is the problem. Sometimes it's the plurality issue where a candidate can get 20% of the vote and be elected or be nominated through that process. And you're saying, wait, we need to have someone who gets over 50%. So identify the problem and then look at the various systems of election. And most of the time, ranked choice voting will come out of, here's a great way to solve whatever the problem is.
So the mayor of Sandy, Utah, this one could be for you, Josh, claims that RCV was more expensive and confused voters.
Well, interestingly, the mayor of Sandy wouldn't be the mayor of Sandy but for ranked choice voting. So the candidate who ran for mayor, who ultimately won, had they had a plurality system with a sort of a primary plurality and a general runoff, which is the traditional system in Utah, she wouldn't have won. The only reason she won was because of ranked choice voting. And what they did in Utah, which cities have the option to do, is rather than have a two-cycle election like Georgia with a general and a runoff, what we do in our nonpartisan municipal elections is we essentially have a primary, nonpartisan, and then a runoff, which is the general, and you narrow the field down to just two candidates for every office. Well, that's expensive because the cities have to pay for both cycles of this election. And in the case of Sandy and other cities, they get to save half the cost of elections because they eliminate that first round, if you will, and they simply have the general election with all five candidates, let's say, running for mayor, and you rank and determine the winner that way. And so actually they absolutely saved money. I don't know where they come up with the idea that it costs more. I think the county told them, look, if you use ranked choice voting, there's an additional charge for some software. It's like, okay, but you're saving the cost of running an entire cycle of an election. And so
let's break down that cost for just a second. We're talking about polling location rental.
That's right.
Polling workers.
Yep.
The paper.
The
time and salaries of all the people that are involved.
Yep.
All of that cost.
That's right.
Gets eliminated in that second.
Totally. In our case in Utah, we have universal vote by mail. Every voter that's actively registered gets a ballot in the mail. That's expensive. The total administrative cost for elections is $2.25 per registered voter. That was the charge that we as the county would charge the cities. So when they have a ranked election and they eliminate an entire round of elections, they're cutting the total cost in half. So it's $2.25 for the primary and $2.25 for the general. And then we just charge them for the general if they're not having a primary. And that's what happened with Sandy. The only thing that costed more is the county said, well, we are going to add a surcharge because there's this extra software component that's like, a few $100 or $1,000 or something.
So that software in Georgia would cost about $1 million if we implemented it statewide for every race. And the cost to our local governments to execute a runoff is about $75 million. So the cost of that software is 1/75th the cost of running a runoff statewide. Next slide there. The claim is that it provides voters an incentive to game the system and falsify their preferences for candidates to beat the system. As one analyst says, the tactic is to upvote your lesser evil candidate and bury your lesser evil candidate's most viable opponent. How in the world does that make sense?
I'm genuinely very confused by what this is telling me.
This is the most confusing thing about ranked choice voting is the opposition.
My job is to understand anything a voter may think to do on a ranked choice voting ballot. I don't know what I'm being told to do here. Like, that's fundamentally the thing for me, is how you need to have like an incredibly sophisticated like voter control mechanism here to tell these people in this neighborhood on these streets, you have to rank these people first, these people second, these people third. That way your secret first choice, who's actually the person you ranked third, will still win the election. I can't even imagine how you would herd those cats to make this happen.
I think what's happened is because you can do this type of stuff under plurality voting, they want to equate plurality voting to ranked choice voting. One of the huge benefits of ranked choice voting is that it is a pure experience for the voters. Who do you like the most? They're number one. Who do you like the second most? They're number two. There are no games. There are no mathematical calculations. Well, wait, I've got to vote for the person who can beat the candidate that I hate the most, rather than the candidate I like the most. That's the type of stuff we think about in plurality elections. In ranked choice voting, there's none of that. And so this claim is trying to refute the purity and how simple it is for the voter by just putting up made-up stuff.
And very few voters vote strategically like that, too. But like Burlington, Vermont could be an example where you had Republicans and Democrats and a progressive. The progressive won. And everybody's like, how does this make sense? And it's like, well, here's how it makes sense. Some Republicans were like, I don't want the Democrat. Oh, so you want the progressive? Yeah. Like, I don't know why Republicans did that. Some people would think, well, wait, if you're on this spectrum, left and right, and progressive is further left than the Democrat, wouldn't you rank the Democrat second? Well, sure, maybe, but like, you're still a voter and you get to choose. And if your vote is I'm a Republican and I don't want the Democrats to win, so it's going to be Republican 1, Progressive 2, and Democrat 3, that's how they ended up with the progressive mayor. But those are voters making choices that were rational to those voters. And that's what we get to do in our democracy. Voters get to choose.
And there are all kinds of things that go into an election, and it starts with candidate quality, frankly. If you have somebody who is running that shouldn't be, or has a lot of baggage, or has a bad reputation with a lot of people, and we could all name one in Georgia, we could probably name one in Alaska, where candidate quality is where elections start, where the ultimate outcome of an election starts, begins with the quality of the candidate that is running, and whether they're a nominated candidate or if they're in a primary. So with that, I want to take an opportunity to thank each of you for your work and for being here today. Obviously, there are a lot of myths about ranked choice voting. Hopefully, we've been able to shine a light on how some of them simply are not true, and that even when they are true, it's not really necessarily a criticism of ranked choice voting as much as it is runoffs in general. But there is so much out there, and we'll need your help over time. If you're interested in learning more, you can find us at our website. That QR code will take you there. I just want to take an opportunity to thank, again, our legislators who attended, and for our special guest today on the panel. We really appreciate you. Thank you. Thank you all.